Okay, so welcome back. And now we're going to look at how you would, some of the rhetorical strategies you could use to talk about how Kennedy achieves his purpose. And I would say his purpose is to try to pressure U.S. Steel into lowering their prices and to anger the American public um, over, I guess, their greed, his perceived idea of their greed. So a lot of passages use pathos. So, and you in an essay, you wouldn't call it pathos, and you wouldn't even call it appeal to emotion. You would want to be specific. He appeals to the anger of the everyday American, and I think he's attempting to appeal to U.S. Steel's shame. And various ways he does this. He uses very emotional diction with those words like, what was it, ruthless disregard of public responsibilities. He says, wholly unjustifiable and irresponsible defiance of the public interest. So he uses very strong diction. The examples that he chooses to use are extremely emotional. Um, he talks about crises in Berlin and Southeast Asia, reservists leaving homes and families for months, servicemen risking their lives. He mentions 4 killed. Um, uh, so the examples he gives are very emotional. The examples that he gives over here for the effects, the American family, talks about the kind of the effects on them, the businessman and the farmer, I mean, kind of the backbone of America, how it's going to raise their prices. Older citizens could be losing pensions. So the emotions, so he brings up the I guess the examples that he uses. He's bringing up very strong emotional examples where it would anger people, and they would recognize this is not just some rich guy doing something on that he has every right to do. It's something that's also going to affect me, and so very strong emotional effects there. And in the midst of that, he keeps bringing back in U.S. Steel, that and saying it's a tiny handful of executives, power, profit exceeds their shows their utter contempt for all 185 million American citizens. So the examples are very emotional, and so to definitely create that anger, that U.S. Steel would do such a thing to, I guess, everyday Americans, middle class, and so that would anger a big chunk of the American society. Um, so he also, so that's pathos, and almost every passage is going to use some amount of pathos. And so when you're asked to analyze a rhetorical strategy, rhetorical strategies, pathos is a lot of times a really good choice, a fallback choice. You can fall on it and fall back to it, and use that to help you, or use that in your analysis. Kennedy also does use logos. He very often gives a stance followed by examples or facts and statistics. And how does that help him achieve his purpose of making America angry and shaming U.S. Steel? Well, it makes him seem rational and not just some, emotional, angry, irrational guy, but he's rational, and it's hard to argue against all of the facts that he gives and the statistics. So by giving a stance, following it up with specific examples, that's logical. By Another logical appeal is by saying, you can't defend U.S. Steel. There's no justification, and he gives very specific reasons why, backed up with, like I said, statistics and numbers and so on. So this logos helps him to help to achieve his purpose of shaming U.S. Steel and saying what they've done is wrong. So that's another device. You could also talk about his structure. He uses lots of juxtaposition throughout his paper, throughout the speech. He does a lot of U.S. versus U.S. Steel. He talks about, in one paragraph he'll talk about all of the sacrifices that U.S. citizens have made, and then in the same paragraph talk about the greed of U.S. Steel. And one example of that is where he talks about 100,000 steel workers lost their jobs over the last 3 years, and yet over the last 5 years, each of the last 5 years, they have raked in $600 million. And so what this juxtaposition does is it sort of makes us an us versus them mentality. And it makes them out, U.S. Steel, to be the bad guy. They're destructive. They're un-American. They're unpatriotic. And so that, I think that also helps him to achieve his purpose. He uses ethos as well. He uses a lot of first person pronouns, us and we and I and so on, or us and we. He is, even though he is a JFK was a millionaire, Harvard graduate. He wanted to be perceived in this as I'm one of you. I'm one of you, average Americans. So I think he was using that to help appeal to his audience and make himself seem more accessible. He also uses in structure, if you wanted to discuss structure as a rhetorical strategy, a lot of repetition. He uses the word American quite a lot. So I see it here, 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 here. Probably uses it in quite a few other places, but it seems like he does bring in that word quite a bit. And so by repeating American, American people, American family, American businessmen and farmers, American goods, he could have just said, the people will find it hard to, as I do, to accept the situation anyway. But he chose to say the American people. And he could have said the cost of homes and cars and appliances and all that will rise for every family. And it's understood that it's American family, but he made sure to put that in there, American, American. So he's repeating this word American to emphasize that the big bad company here is hurting and sort of attacking Americans. And he does mention that they are at war, and it seems to be that one of the enemies is U.S. Steel. And so, again, that's going to help him to achieve his purpose of getting U.S. Steel, pressuring them into lowering their prices. And not just through this news conference, but Americans kind of rising up against U.S. Steel and creating anger in the Americans can hurt U.S. Steel's bottom line. Anyway, so you could, in this passage, when it talks about what is his purpose and what rhetorical strategies does he use to achieve it, he uses pathos, and pathos involves various things like the diction and the examples that he gives. And of course, again, you wouldn't say pathos in your paper. You would say he appeals to anger, he appeals to shame. You could talk about his use of logos. That's another rhetorical strategy. And he has lots of great parts of that. And then you could also talk about structure. Structure is a great rhetorical strategy, using lots of this juxtaposition, creating this us versus them mentality. He uses ethos, setting himself up to be, your average American Joe, a relatable person. He uses that repetition of American, kind of, this is what's happening to American families, and sort of uniting American citizens against U.S. Steel, and that they've been attacked in a sense by U.S. Steel. Anyway, so now what I want to do is I'm going to stop here and do another video where we look at some of the sample essays. And so I'll start out with 2B.